So on Tuesday, we got a brand new article from Game Informer, and why I go over the details of that article and what implications it may have in episode 6 of the Rubicon Dogs podcast. This time, I want to cover a tiny little detail of that article, hidden away in a little screenshot off to the side, that actually gives us a ton of information. See, the screenshot in question is actually an additional view of the assembly. And this one has way more weapons unlocked than the previous video that we've seen. Now there's the obvious points, like a new weapon shown off, we see this burst assault rifle, we see a chain gun shown below it in the scrolling menu to the left, and a few other weapons as well. But the actual secret in this screenshot is in the scroll bar beside those weapons. And I want to give a shout out to Celticspear on Reddit who first brought this to everyone's attention. They took a close look at it and did the math by measuring the pixels off to the side of both the small scroll bar as well as the total scroll area that it can go. And after taking a look at it myself, I'm pretty sure they're right in their estimation of how many weapons the screenshot shows us. But I don't think it necessarily tells the whole story. So there's a small section of that scroll bar that represents the current 5 weapons shown. If you compare that to the total area it's possible to scroll through, you'll come out with roughly 11 of those bars, a little bit shorter for the very top bar, so 10 and some change. So that's 5 weapons shown, multiplied by the possible 11 bars, gives us about 55 weapons. The top section would be a little bit shorter, so 54 weapons. And then the very first entry in that list is likely to be a nothing unequipped slot, though it's entirely possible that we just do that with triangle, so there might be an install-uninstall option instead. But we come out to about 53, maybe 54 weapons we could expect from this screenshot. In the Game Informer article itself, they talk about how the debug build that they're watching has every optional part unlocked. Though we don't actually get a direct From Software quote on that, it's more the interviewers. But if we assume they're right, or were just previously told that and take them at their word, then the build that they saw has every weapon unlocked. This has led a lot of people online to take a look at that screenshot and assume that this is probably right, that we have roughly 53 to 54 unlockable ARM weapons. And while it's entirely possible that that's right, it's also a little bit of a fallacy. You see, the screenshots in question likely weren't taken by the interviewers, but rather provided to Game Informer from Software themselves. And that means we have no way of knowing if this screenshot is actually every unlockable weapon, or if it's from a build or a point in the game that doesn't have everything shown. And that means that, at a minimum, we can expect 53 to 54 ARM weapons. But it's entirely possible that we get more, potentially even a lot more. It's also important to note that this screenshot shows the left side ARM weapons. And that's important because From Software has already confirmed that melee weapons are exclusive to the left arm. And that means that even if there are no right-hand exclusive weapons, and all of the guns can be held on either arm, that this list on the left side is still more weapons than we're going to get on the right side. And while we don't know how many melee weapons we're going to get, we at least have a few confirmed in the form of the pulse blade, the laser dagger. We can assume that there will be a moonlight laser blade. We know of at least one pile driver. There's the hopeful possibilities of the lance or the whip that we see MTs use. And then we potentially have the mine launcher that's shown in the trailer, where the quad leg flings all the explosives out. We don't actually know if it qualifies as a left-hand melee weapon, but it is strapped to the left arm, so it's a possibility. Assuming we get all of those and nothing else, which is incredibly doubtful, then it'll put us at right about 47, 48 maybe, individual guns that can be used by both arms, plus the melees. But how does that stack up? Is that actually a good number of starting ARM weapons for an Armored Core game? Let's compare. And before we do, it's important to note that Armored Core has pretty much always released a base game, and then at least one expansion game. So for 4th generation, you had Armored Core 4, followed by Armored Core 4 Answer. In 5th gen, we had Armored Core 5, followed by Armored Core Verdict Day. And it was like that even at the very beginning. And that's important because the base game always has less parts. There's always been an expansion game that heavily expanded the amount of parts that we could choose from. So, is that 54 weapons good? Well, if we compare it against 4th and 5th gen, and just a disclaimer here that I did get a lot of these numbers from the Armored Core wiki, as I don't currently have my save files for all of the unlockable parts in all of these games. With that being said, Armored Core 4 released with 39 arm weapons and 36 back weapons. Now, why do I bring up back weapons when we're talking about arm weapons? Well, that reason is because in 5th generation, they sort of did away with back weapons. In place of having 2 arm weapons and 2 back weapons, we get a back-mounted carousel system, and so they would hold additional arm weapons that we could trade out with our current equipped ones. So, for example, you might have a rifle in your left arm and a shotgun on your left back, and you could put up the rifle and pull out the shotgun on this carousel system. So as I do get into the 5th gen numbers, it's important to understand they are higher than 4th gen, but that's because there's only arm weapons. And so I think it's important to compare them as the arm weapons in 4th gen, and then what 5th gen likely would have is the same percentage of arm versus back if it actually had back weapons. And the amount of arm weapons versus back weapons tends to stay right around a 50% ratio, give or take. And so while Armored Core 5 had 140 arm weapons, it was probably really about 70 or so had it functioned like all the rest of the games in the series. And again, it's just to get a baseline, so I wanted to use some more recent generations as opposed to some older ones. So 70 arm weapons as opposed to the 39 we got in Gen 4? Now that sounds like a lot, but much like our earlier screenshot, it doesn't really tell the full story. See, Armored Core 5 was a little unique in that it often had model weapons. So you'd have a rifle models 1, 2, and 3 with expanded ammo or higher damage output or slightly varying stats. So while the numbers are high, they weren't actually necessarily unique individual weapons. It was more that they were the same weapons with various sets of raised and lowered stats. They even used the same model. So if you consider the alternate model numbers, as well as just a lack of back weapons, and so lowering to account for that, you'd probably get right around that same area of 39 or so weapons. Though 5th gen likely would have had a little bit more, maybe closer to like 45 to 50. And with that, AC6, assuming that's the full entire roster of weapons that we get, isn't doing that bad for a base game. It's pretty in line with what we should expect. There have been a few people talk about what if the scroll bar on the left side scrolled at a different rate than the selection of weapons on the right side, which is definitely a fair argument, but I think if we look close at the original assembly footage that we have, we can see that they pretty much are in line. And so I personally feel like the math is probably pretty accurate on that screenshot. But in addition to that, there's also one other small detail that screenshot holds for us. And it's something that I didn't bring up when I originally talked about the assembly footage, and it's something I haven't personally seen anybody mention or talk about. Take a closer look at that screenshot, specifically up there at the top where it shows the left and the right back units. What are those little square dots beside them? Here, I'll zoom in a little bit closer for you. You see, each back unit has 2 square dots beside them, one of which is highlighted, and one of which is grayed out. Now, this isn't something I had originally paid a whole lot of attention to when I was going through the assembly footage, but when I was taking a closer look at the screenshot, I noticed them again, and really got to wondering what they could be, and if I did have a theory, if I had any proof to back it up. Now, going back through the assembly footage, my running theory that these 2 dots represented using either a standard primary back weapon or using that same carousel system that 5 had that we knew was returning in 6. So if we take a look at the first AC they show us in the assembly footage, and we take a closer look at those dots, we see that same thing. The dots highlighted on the left side, while we have a shield and missile equipped, both of which we know are standard back weapons that are fired from your back. However, later in the footage, there's a couple frames where we get a glimpse at that same shoulder icon, but with the right dot highlighted. And if we take a close look at the AC, that's not the same shield on the left back side. I imagine it's the shotgun we see later. Zooming in on that icon, you can again see the right dot is highlighted instead. So while it's not a game-breaking new discovery, we know what the dots mean. The left dot represents a primary backfired weapon, while the right dot represents a carouseled weapon, something that you can't fire directly from your back, but that you can trade out for that corresponding arm weapon. So there you go, just another nice touch to the new assembly screen that just shows you with a little bit more clarity what it is that you have equipped and how it functions. So once again, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.